Good morning, and welcome back to the channel where I share my opinions on movies and TV shows, then convince you on whether or not they are worth the watch. Back at it again, are we? Yes, I am, but this time I'm done with pirates and moving on to a film that I've been wanting to talk about for years. Good on you. Also, I'm trying out a new video structure since I'm going to do a book-to-film adaptation review instead of just a normal film review. That's cool. Which book is it? Silas Marner. Oh, a George Eliot novel. Good choice. Yep, and I'm going to compare the book to one of his many adaptations. Which one? A Simple Twist of Fate. Cool. So, no pirates? Nope. Just a cute, heartwarming tale of a broken man finding love and life in an orphan girl he raised after she stumbled upon his home one winter's night. Sounds like a good review. I guess I'll leave you alone now so you can get started. Actually, editor, I want you to stay for this video. Why? Aren't you capable of doing it by yourself? Well... You haven't read the book, have you? No. Fine, I'll help. It's not like I'm dependent on your success or anything. Yay! Thanks, editor! But before I do, you need to change it to something more appropriate. What are you talking about? Oh, sorry, I got used to the pirate look. I can tell. Anyway, I think it's time to start the review. I agree! Roll the intro! Of course, before going into the stories of book and film, we need to talk about the history of both. Of course, I almost forgot about this section. Sure you did. Anyway, starting with the author, George Eliot is the pen name for Mary Ann Evans, who was born in the United Kingdom in 1819. She grew up getting the best education available to her and excelling in literature and foreign languages. Unfortunately, at age 16, she had to stop going to school and take on home responsibilities after her mother died. But she still continued her education through private teachers and self-study, mastering Latin in the process. Later in life, she got to work translating Latin church works into English and writing articles for left-wing journalism before publishing her first fiction work called Saints of Clerical Life, which is a book containing 3 short stories that Mary published under her pen name, George Eliot. So, why did she write under a different name instead of her own? And why is her pen name a more masculine-sounding one? Well, George was very critical of work written by women, and she knows if she wants her books to be recognized and taken seriously in the literature world, she has to publish them under a different name that sounded like a man's name rather than her obviously female-sounding one. A practice that still exists today in more countries than just the English-speaking ones. And it worked. As more of her books came out, more and more people read them without knowing the author's gender, and once people did find out, instead of changing their tunes to criticize her, George was instead praised for her work and became one of England's most prized authors. The only thing she was criticized for was getting into a relationship with an older man who was still married, even though they met when he was in the process of leaving his wife. But that didn't get in the way of her book sales and having a statue made of her to remember her accomplishments. Although her book Silas Marner wasn't as popular as Adam Bede or as acclaimed as Middlemarch, it was the book that a lot of young people read and enjoyed, which later led to the book being adapted. A lot! And one of those films that came out in 1985 has Bing Kingsley playing Silas Marner, and people remember this film being shown in English class after reading the book. But as you can tell, this isn't the adaptation that I am reviewing. Why is that? It's because I have more to talk about in A Simple Twist of Fate than I do with the book-accurate film. Speaking of A Simple Twist of Fate, the film came out in 1994 with the lead played by Steve Martin and the story taking place in the 80s USA instead of 1800s England. Why? Because taking things from the Brits is funny.
I say.
Unfortunately, the film wasn't received well by both critics and audiences. Roger Ebert even commented on the film stating,
I can't quite recommend it, and one of the problems is that although I love Victorian melodrama, and I read Dickens and Trollope and George Eliot all the time, this movie, set in the modern time, seems so contrived that there was always something a little bit inexplicable about everything that was happening. It didn't seem to really generate any reality of its own.
So, is Roger right in thinking that the film was a poor adaptation? Or is Roger wrong for nitpicking a perfectly good movie? You ready for the summaries? Yep, let's get this over with. The book opens up to us learning about our main character, Silas Marner, a young weaver who lives alone and suffers from these bouts of fits where he stares at nothing and doesn't move for a long while. And when he wakes back up, he would have no idea how much time has passed or if anyone has walked by him. This view of Marner's personality was not without another ground than his pale face and unexampled eyes. For Jim Rodney, the mole catcher, averred that one evening he was returning homeward, he saw Silas Marner leaning against a stile with a heavy bag on his back, instead of resting the bag on the stile as a man in his senses would have done. And that, on coming up to him, he saw that Marner's eyes were set like a dead man's, and he spoke to him, and shook him, and his limbs were stiff, and his hands clenched the bag as if they'd been made of iron. But just as he made up his mind that the weaver was dead, he came all right again, like, as you might say, in the wink of an eye, and said, "Good night," and walked off. One day, the church he attended in his hometown accused Silas of stealing money from them and kicked him out for it. Silas knew that the only person to have stolen the money was his best friend William, but because he looked up to him, Silas kept the information to himself and prayed that God would clear his name. William exhorted his friend to confess, not to hide his sin any longer. Silas turned a look of keen reproach to him and said, "William, for 9 years that we have gone in and out together, have you ever known me tell a lie? But God will clear me." "Brother," said William, "how do I know what you may have done in the secret chambers of your heart, to give Satan an advantage over you?" Silas was still looking at his friend. Suddenly, a deep flush came over his face, and he was about to speak impetuously, when he seemed checked again by some inward shock that sent the flush back and made him tremble. But at last he spoke feebly, looking at William. "I remember now. The knife wasn't in my pocket." William said, "I know nothing what you mean." The other persons present, however, began to inquire where Silas meant to say that the knife was, but he would give no further explanation. He only said, "I am sore stricken. I can say nothing. God will clear me." But when that didn't happen, Silas's fiancée broke off their engagement to marry William, and Silas, heartbroken and betrayed, left his hometown and moved to Revelo, where he stayed for the next 15 years selling his woven fabrics and counting the gold he has hidden in his home every night, claiming them to be his one and only true love in the world. How the guineas shone as they came pouring out of the dark leather mouths. The silver bore no large proportion in amount to the gold, because the long pieces of linen which formed his chief work were always partially paid for in gold, and out of the silver he supplied his own bodily wants, choosing always the shillings and sixpences to spend in this way. He loved the guineas best, but he would not change the silver, the crowns and half-crowns that were his own earnings, begotten by his labor. He loved them all. The movie starts a bit differently, but with the same results. Michael McCann, played by Steve Martin, doesn't suffer from fits like his book counterpart does, but is instead a schoolteacher and carpenter. But one day, his expecting wife visits the school he worked at to tell him some bad news.
"It's not yours, Michael. She's not yours."
Distraught by the news, Michael moved from Washington, D.C. to Virginia, where he stayed for the next 5 years selling his carpentry work to the local townsfolk. At night, he counts the large collection of gold coins he has hidden in his home every night, claiming them to be his one and only love.
"Silver's good. Why does gold?"
Always there for you when you need it. I'll take the coin. Thank you, Mrs. Simon.
In both book and film, the townsfolk know that the lonely man doesn't keep his money in a bank, and with all the work Silas and Michael has done, there must be a lot of money hidden somewhere in their home.
You know, Jody, down at the bank, she says, Ken ain't got no bank account. Never even cashes a check. I think he keeps it at home.
Good for him.
We then jump to Godfrey and Dustin Cass. Both are sons of the town's greatest and respected man, Squire Cass. But the boys are seen as disappointments by both town and father, one more so than the other. And though some license was to be allowed to young men whose fathers could afford it, people shook their heads at the courses of the second son, Dunstan, commonly called Dunsay Cass, whose taste for swooping and betting might turn out to be a sowing of something worse than wild oats. To be sure, the neighbor said, it was no matter what became of Dunsay, a spiteful, jeering fellow who seemed to enjoy his drink the more when other people went dry, always provided that his doings did not bring trouble on a family like Squire Cass's, with a monument in the church and takards older than King George. But it would be 1,000 pities if Mr. Godfrey, the eldest, a fine, open-faced, good-natured young man who was to come into the land someday, should take to going along the same road with his brother, as he had seemed to do of late. But what the townfolk aren't aware of is that Godfrey, the better of the two boys, is hiding his estranged wife Molly Farron in another town with their child. The reason he doesn't want to tell anybody about the woman is because she is a gold-digging drug addict who cares more about claiming Godfrey's family money than being a good wife and mother. And Dustin is aware of this and takes advantage of his older brother because he knows this secret. "Oh," said Dunsey, sneeringly, coming nearer to his brother and looking in his face. "Suppose now you get the money yourself and save me the trouble, eh? Since you was so kind as to hand it over to me, you'll not refuse me the kindness to pay it back for me. It was your brotherly love made you do it, you know." Godfrey bit his lips and clenched his fist. "Don't come near me with that look, else I'll knock you down." "Oh no, you won't," said Dunsey, turning away on his heel. "However, because I'm such a good-natured brother, you know, I might get you turned out of the house and home, and cut off with a shilling every day. I might tell the squire how his handsome son was married to that nice young woman, Molly Farron, and was very unhappy because he couldn't live with his drunken wife, and I should slip into your place as comfortably as could be. But you see, I don't do it. I'm so easy and good-natured. You'll take any trouble for me. You'll get the £100 for me. I know you will." The movie changed things a bit here, but the town's opinion of the brothers is still roughly the same. John Newland, played by Gabriel Byron, is a rich man from an influential family who is running for the town's local government.
"And you can tell them that if they vote for me, not only do I promise world peace, but I'll fix all the potholes in Stewart Street."
His younger brother, Tanny Newland, played by Stephen Baldwin, is the town's troublemaker who loves to drink, gamble, and remind his brother about his secret drug addict woman and innocent child in the other town.
Tell him we need more. Tell him his little girl needs more.
I do tell him, but it doesn't help.
One day, Godfrey asks Dustin to sell off his beloved horse Wildfire and bring him the money so that he can pay off some debts he has with someone. Dustin agrees to do this, but before he can trade the horse for the money, Dustin accidentally kills the poor animal from messing around. Dustin, however, took one fence too many and got his horse pierced with a hedge stake. His own ill-favored person, which was quite unmarketable, escaped without injury, but poor Wildfire, unconscious of his price, turned on his flank and painfully panted his last. It happened that Dunstan, a short time before, having had to get down to arrange his stirrup, had muttered a good many curses at this interruption, which had thrown him in the rear of the hunt near the moment of glory, and under this exasperation had taken the fences more blindly. He would soon have been up with the hounds again when the fatal accident happened. And hence he was between eager riders in advance, not troubling themselves about what happened behind them, and far-off stragglers who were as likely as not to pass quite aloof from the line of road in which Wildfire had fallen. Dunstan, whose nature it was to care for more immediate annoyances than for remote consequences, no sooner recovered his legs, and saw that it was all over with Wildfire, than he felt a satisfaction at the absence of witnesses to a position which no swaggering could make enviable. Then, after abandoning Wildfire, Dustin walks aimlessly in the night fog until he finds his way to Silas's cottage. Remembering the rumor about the lonely man hiding money in his house, Dustin approaches the small cottage in hopes of convincing Silas to loan his money to him. He was still nearly 3/4 of a mile from home, and the lane was becoming unpleasantly slippery, for the mist was passing into rain. He turned up the bank, not without some fear lest he might miss the right way, since he was not certain whether the light were in front or on the side of the cottage. But he felt the ground before him cautiously with his whip handle, and at last arrived safely at the house. But once Dustin gets to Silas's house, he finds that the front door is open and Silas isn't home. Taking advantage of this, Dustin searches the house and finds the hidden hole in the floor where the bags of gold are hidden. He then collects the gold and leaves the house before Silas comes home, never to be seen again. Hardly more than 5 minutes had passed since he entered the cottage, but it seemed to Dustin like a long while. And though he was without any distinct recognition of the possibility that Marner might be alive and might re-enter the cottage at any moment, he felt an undefinable dread laying hold on him. As he rose to his feet with the bags in his hand, he would hasten out into the darkness, and then consider what he should do with the bags. He closed the door behind him immediately, that he might shut in the stream of light. A few steps would be enough to carry him beyond betrayal by the gleams from the shutter chinks in the latch hole. The rain and darkness had got thicker, and he was glad of it, though it was awkward walking with both hands filled, so that it was as much as he could do to grasp his whip along with one of the bags. But when he had gone a yard or two, he might take his time, so he stepped forward into the darkness. The film plays this particular section a little differently. Tanny delivered money to Marcia Swanson, played by Amelia Campbell, for John, then came back with a photo of the child as a way to convince him to give Marcia more money later. Then Tanny takes John's fancy car out on a joyride with a date, then crashes it due to the combination of the darkness, fog, and high on drugs. PSA kids, don't do drugs, especially while driving. Agreed. Anyway, Tanny manages to get out of the accident roughly unharmed and runs off towards Michael's house. He then finds the front door unlocked and Michael asleep. Tanny takes advantage of this and snoops around the house to find the rumored hidden gold. And he does. After finding the gold, Tanny then collects them all up and leaves the house before Michael wakes up and is never to be seen again.
I kind of think it was someone who knew the area the way they disappeared. You got insurance?
Now, here is a big difference between the book and the film. In the book, nobody had a clue that Dustin was the one to steal the gold, and just assumed he skipped town to cause trouble elsewhere. Well, Mr. Godfrey, that's a lucky brother of yours, that Master Dunsey, isn't he? What do you mean? Said Godfrey hastily. Why? Hasn't he been home yet? Said Bryce. Home? No. What has happened? Be quick. What has he done with my horse? Ah, I thought it was yours, though he pretended you had parted with it to him. Has he thrown him down and broken his knees? Said Godfrey, flushed with exasperation. Worse than that, said Bryce. You see, I made a bargain with him to buy the horse for 120, swinging price, but I always liked the horse. And what does he do but go and stake him? Fly at a hedge with stakes in it on top of a bank with a ditch before it. The horse had been dead a pretty good while when he was found. So, he hasn't been home since, has he? Home? No, said Godfrey, and he better keep away. Confound me for a fool. Might have known this would be the end of it. Well, to tell you the truth, said Bryce, after I bargained for the horse, it did come into my head that he might be riding and selling the horse without your knowledge, for I didn't believe it was his own. I knew Master Dunsey was up to his tricks sometimes, but where can he be gone? He's never been seen at Batherley. He couldn't have been hurt, for he must have walked off. Hurt? Said Godfrey, bitterly. He'll never be hurt. He's made to hurt other people. While in the film, John knew that his brother was the one to steal from Michael, but he didn't care about it as long as his brother is no longer around and is having fun making trouble elsewhere.
Plus, he made a pretty quick getaway. There wasn't a trace of him, so it must have been okay.
Tanner wouldn't hurt himself, as you know, Cal. He just likes to hurt others.
Months pass, and it is now the new year, and the town is invited to the yearly party at Godfrey's house to celebrate. Silas was also invited, but he stayed home because he is still mourning the loss of his gold. Same thing with Michael in the film. In the next town over, Molly is pissed that Godfrey still isn't claiming her as his wife and decides to pay him a visit with their child. This journey on New Year's Eve was a premeditated act of vengeance which she had kept in her heart ever since Godfrey, in a fit of passion, had told her he would sooner die than acknowledge her as his wife. There would be a great party at the Red House on New Year's Eve. She knew. Her husband would be smiling and smiled upon, hiding her existence in the darkest corner of his heart, but she would mar his pleasure. She would go in her dingy rags, with her faded face, once as handsome as the best, with her little child that had its father's hair and eyes, and disclose herself to the squire as his eldest son's wife. Same thing with Marcia, but it's more money-driven than revenge for abandoning her.
Where is the money man?
So Marcia and Molly walk in the snow with their child in their arms until the cold gets too much on their weakened body, and they sit down a short distance away from Silas's and Michael's home. Slowly the demon was working his will, and cold and weariness were his helpers. Soon she felt nothing but a supreme immediate longing that curtained off all futurity, the longing to lie down and sleep. She had arrived at a spot where her footsteps were no longer checked by a hedgerow, and she had wandered vaguely, unable to distinguish any objects, notwithstanding the wide whiteness around her and the growing starlight. She sank down against a straggling furze bush, a easy pillow enough, and the bed of snow, too, was soft. She did not feel that the bed was cold, and did not heed whether the child would wake and cry for her, but her arms had not yet relaxed their instinctive clutch, and the little one slumbered on as gently as if it had been rocked in a lace-trimmed cradle. Luckily for the little girl, She sees Silas's glowing cottage and pulls herself out of her mother's arms and waddles her way through the snow and towards the warm glow at the cottage. Silas then, just at that moment, opened his front door to look out into the snow, but before he can shut the door, a fit came over him and the little girl snuck in. He leaned forward at last and stretched forth his hand, but instead of the hard coin with the familiar resisting outline, his fingers encountered soft, warm curls. In utter amazement, Silas fell on his knees and bent his head low to examine the marvel. It was a sleeping child, a round, fair thing with soft yellow rings all over its head. Same thing with Michael, except he wasn't suffering from a fit at the door. He just happened to step out of his home to collect more firewood and didn't see Marcia and the little girl nearby. At least, until the little girl made her presence known inside his home.
Ah! Jeez!
Both Michael and Silas then find the little girl's mother passed out in the snow, then quickly head into town to find the doctor at Godfrey's and John's party, who is very surprised to see the little girl in his home. But when Godfrey lifted his eyes from one of those long glances, they encountered an object as startling to him at that moment as if it had been an apparition from the dead. It was an apparition from that hidden life which lies, like a dark by-street, behind the goodly ornamented facade that meets the sunlight and the gaze of respectable admirers. It was his own child carried in Silas Marner's arms. That was his instantaneous impression, unaccompanied by doubt, though he had not seen the child for months past, and when the hope was rising that he might possibly be mistaken, Mr. Krakenthorpe and Mr. Lemaitre had already advanced to Silas, in astonishment at this strange advent. Godfrey joined them immediately, unable to rest without hearing every word, trying to control himself, but conscious that if anyone noticed him, they might see that he was white-lipped and trembling. A small party of people was formed, and the group made their way to Silas's cottage, where they find the passed-out frozen woman, and after the doctor confirmed that the girl's mother is dead, Godfrey turns to Silas and asks him what he plans on doing about the child. "You'll take the child to the parish tomorrow?" asked Godfrey, speaking as indifferently as he could. "Who says so?" said Marner sharply. "Will they make me take her?" "Why? You wouldn't like to keep her, should you? An old bachelor like you?" "Till anybody shows they've a right to take her from me," said Marner. "The mother's dead, and I reckon it's got no father. It's a lone thing. And I'm a lone thing. My money's gone, I don't know where, and this has come from I don't know where. I know nothing. I'm partially mazed." "Poor little thing," said Godfrey. "Let me give something towards finding it clothes." He had put his hand in his pocket and found half a guinea, and thrusted it into Silas's hand. That conversation in the film didn't happen until the day after Marcia was confirmed dead, and John was against the child staying in town and suggested she be placed in government custody. But Michael insisted on keeping her due to her coming to him, and only him, to replace his gold.
She came to replace my money, you know. What if I kept her?
You mean, kept her here in town?
We then cut to Michael having his interview to convince the authorities that he can take care of the child. But it doesn't really go very well.
I believe this child belongs with me. She walked into my house.
We, the audience, then get a hint that John pulled some strings, which resulted in Michael being able to keep the child.
I talked to Dr. Roberts and I said, "How did this happen?" And he said, "Don't ask." So I didn't. I think I'm a quasi-foster parent with a twist of the arm and a favor outside the system.
Finally, corruption for the good guy.
Yeah, there was no real resistance like that in the book, but then again, adoption regulations probably weren't a thing in the 1800s, and Silas was just allowed to keep the child. And once the townsfolk hears about what Silas did, they started giving advice and small amounts of money to help him raise the child easier. And the most active in being there for Silas is Dolly Winthrop, who is a stay-at-home mother who has years of experience in raising children, and made the habit of visiting Silas and the little girl as much as she could to help, much to Silas's appreciation and annoyance. "Thank you, kindly," said Silas, hesitating a little. "I'll be glad if you'll tell me things, but," he added uneasily, leaning forward to look at Baby with some jealousy, as she was resting her head backwards against Dolly's arm, and eyeing him contentedly from a distance. "But I want to do things for it myself, else I get fond of somebody else and not fond of me. I've been used to fending for myself in the house. I can learn. "To be sure," said Dolly, gently. "I've seen men as are wonderfully handy with children, The men are awkward and contrary mostly, God help them, but when the drink's out of them, they aren't unsensible, though they're bad for leeching and bandaging, so fury and unpatient. You see, this goes first, next the skin, proceeded Dolly, taking up the little shirt and putting it on. Yes, said Marner, docilely bringing his eyes very close, that they might be initiated in the mysteries, whereupon Baby seized his head with both her small arms, and her lips against his face with purring noises. See there, said Dolly, with a woman's tender tact. She's fondest of you. April Simmons, played by Catherine O'Hare, knew Michael before the little girl was introduced because she's an antique store owner who sold the gold coins to Michael and is the only one actively trying to be his friend.
What do you think of this? It's not going to be around here long. Once the weather balloon people get wind of this, they're going to be down here ripping it off the ceiling.
I guess the weather balloon people are a lot like the moosehead collectors in that respect.
Huh?
But only after the little girl is introduced did Michael start accepting her friendship.
This is the first time I've seen you buy something for someone else.
This is for me.
Why?
I was kidding.
Another first, if you don't mind me saying so.
Then we have this conversation in the book about naming the little girl. Well then, Mr. Marner, said Dolly, inwardly rejoiced. I'll ask Mr. Macy to speak to the person about it, and you must fix on a name for it, because it must have a name given when it's christened. My mother's name was Hephzibah, said Silas, and my little sister was named after her. That's a hard name, said Dolly. I partially think it isn't a Christian name. It's a Bible name, said Silas, old ideas recurring. Then I have no call to speak against it, said Dolly, rather startled by Silas's knowledge on his head. But you see, I'm no scholard, and I'm slow at catching the words. My husband says I always like as if I put the heft for the handle. That's what he says, for he's very sharp, God help him. But it was awkward calling your little sister by such a hard name, when you got nothing big to say, like, wasn't it, Master Marner? We called her Eppie, said Silas. Well, if it was nowadays wrong to shorten the name, it'd be a deal-hander. We got that same conversation in the movie, but it feels a bit more awkward.
What about a name for her?
I want to call her Matilda.
I will give you the deed to my house, not to call her Matilda. She's gonna have to spell it out all the time. People will call her Tildy. No.
Yeah, I know, but it's what I've decided.
If anyone calls her Tildy, you're gonna have to kill them.
In April's defense, Roald Dahl's book didn't come out until 1988, and the film is taking place in what year? At this point, it's 5 years after 1979, so 1984. Oh, I see what you mean. The name Matilda isn't that common of a name, and didn't gain popularity or recognition until after the book was released. Actually, the name didn't become popular until after the 1996 film adaptation. The name almost didn't exist for like 20 years before that. Oh. Anyway, during the years that Silas is raising Eppie, Godfrey believed that his secret is now permanently hidden, and he decided that it is safe to marry Nancy Lemaitre, who he had feelings for a long time, but was too nervous to say anything due to not wanting Molly to be discovered. And as it turns out, Nancy also has feelings for him, and the two eventually got married and have been living as a happy couple since. Kind of. A man must have so much on his mind, is a belief by which a wife often supports a cheerful face under rough answers and unfeeling words. And Nancy's deepest wounds had all come from the perception that the absence of children from their hearth was dwelt on her husband's mind as a privation to which he could not reconcile himself. Same thing goes on with John and Nancy in the film, where John is happy that he got to marry the woman he really wanted, but because of the secret weighing down on him, the relationship isn't the best that it could be.
John?
You gotta snap out of this, you're sleepwalking.
And this is where the film goes in a slightly different direction from the book, and the similarities are far fewer. So, would it be alright if I finish off the book summary now? Sure, go right ahead. Cool. We then jump 16 years, and the well that is near Silas's home dried up, and Dustin's body was found down below. The body is holding Godfrey's gold-hilted whip, Dustin's identifier, and Silas's 2 bags of gold, which were returned to the rightful owner. But once news of this discovery made it back to Godfrey, he believed that this is a sign from God that all secrets eventually get revealed, and he needs to come clean to Nancy. Nancy, said Godfrey slowly, when I married you, I hid something from you, something I ought to have told you. That woman Marner found dead in the snow, Eppie's mother, that wretched woman, was my wife. Eppie is my child. He paused, dreading the effect of his confession. But Nancy sat quite still, only that her eyes dropped and ceased to meet his. She was pale and quiet as a meditative statue, clasping her hands on her lap. "You'll never think the same of me again," said Godfrey, after a little while, with some tremor in his voice. She was silent. "I oughtn't to have left the child unowned. I oughtn't to have kept it from you, but I couldn't bear to give you up, Nancy. I was led away into marrying her. I suffered for it." Nancy was initially shocked and upset about what Godfrey said, but instead of focusing on the fact that Godfrey was married to someone before her and even had a child, she instead focused on the fact that he hadn't said anything earlier. "Godfrey, if you had but told me this 6 years ago, we could have done some of our duty by the child. Do you think I'd have refused to take her in if I had known she was yours?" At that moment, Godfrey felt all the bitterness of an error that was not simply futile, but had defeated its own end. He had not measured this wife with whom he had lived so long, but she spoke again, with more agitation. "And, oh Godfrey, if we had her from the first, if you'd taken her as you ought, she'd have loved me for her mother, and you would have been happier with me. I could better have borne my little baby dying, and our life would have been more like what we used to think it 'ud be." The tears fell, and Nancy ceased to speak. "But you wouldn't have married me then, Nancy, if I told you," said Godfrey, urged in the bitterness of his self-reproach, to prove to himself that his conduct had not been utter folly. "You may think you would now, but you wouldn't then. With your pride and your father's, you'd have hated having anything to do with me after the talk there'd have been. I can't say what I should have done about that, Godfrey. I should never have married anybody else. But I wasn't worth doing wrong for. Nothing is in this world. Nothing is so good as it seemed beforehand. Not even our marrying wasn't, you see." There was a faint, sad smile on Nancy's face as she said the last words. "I'm a worse man than you thought I was, Nancy," said Godfrey, rather tremulously. "Can you forgive me, ever? The wrong to me is but little, Godfrey. You've made it up to me. You've been good to me for 15 years. It's another you did the wrong to, and I doubt it can never be made up for." "But we can take Eppie now," said Godfrey. "I won't mind the world knowing at least. I'll be plain and open for the rest of my life." The couple then went to Silas and 18-year-old Eppie to tell them the truth about Godfrey being Eppie's biological father, and to ask for Eppie to come live with them from now on. Unable to really say anything at first, Silas turns to Eppie and tells her that it's her choice to either go with Godfrey and Nancy, or stay with him. And this is her response. "Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. But I can't leave my father, nor own anybody nearer than him. And I don't want to be a lady. Thank you all for the same. I couldn't give up the folks I've been used to." Eppie's lips began to tremble a little at the last words. She retreated to her father's chair again, and held him round the neck, while Silas, with a subdued sob, put up his hand to grasp hers. Godfrey didn't like this answer, and told her that he has a right to her as her real father, and now that he is here to claim her, she needs to go with him and live her life with him. Silas, rightfully so, gets pissed. "Then, sir, why didn't you say so 16 years ago, and claim her before I'd come to love her, instead of coming to take her from me now, when you might as well take the heart out of my body? God gave her to me because you turned your back upon her, and he looks upon her as mine. You've no right to her. When a man turns a blessing from his door, it falls upon them to take it in." "I know that, Marner. I was wrong. I've repented of my conduct in that matter," said Godfrey, who couldn't help feeling the edge of Silas's words. "I'm glad to hear it, sir," said Marner with gathering excitement. "But repentance doesn't alter what's been going on for 16 years. You're coming now and saying I'm her father doesn't alter the feelings inside us. It's me she's been calling her father ever since she could say the word." "But I think you might look at the thing more reasonably, Marner," said Godfrey, unexpectedly awed by the weaver's direct truth-speaking. "It isn't as if she was to be taken away from you, so that you'd never see her again. She'll be very near you, and come to see you very often. She'll feel just the same towards you." "Just the same?" said Marner more bitterly than ever. "How she'll feel just the same from me as she does now, when we eat out the same bit, and drink at the same cup, and think of the same things from one day's end to another. Just the same? That's idle talk. You cut us in two." The argument then ends with Eppie continuing to stand by Silas, and telling the couple that she is thankful for the offer, but she would rather stay by Silas's side, the man who she deems to be her real father, and nobody can separate them. The upset couple then claim that they will come back to get her and leave Silas's cottage, but once the couple reach home, they have calmed down and talked about whether what they did was right or not. But presently he put out his hand, and as Nancy placed hers within it, he drew her towards him and said, "That's ended. She bent to kiss him, and then said as she stood by his side, "Yes, I'm afraid we must give up the hope of having her for a daughter. It wouldn't be right to want to force her to come to us against her will. We can't alter her bringing up and what's come of it." "No," said Godfrey, with a keen decisiveness of tone, in contrast with his usually careless and unempathetic speech. "There's debts we can't pay like money debts. By paying extra for the years that have slipped by, while I've been putting off and putting off, the trees have been growing. It's too late now." Marner was in the right in what he said about a man's turning away a blessing from his door. It falls to somebody else. "I wanted to pass for childless once, Nancy. I shall pass for childless now against my wish." Nancy did not speak immediately, but after a while she asked, "You won't make it known then? About Eppie's being your daughter?" "No. Where would be the good to anybody? Only harm." The book then concluded with Eppie and Aaron, Dolly's youngest son, getting married and moving in with Silas, and Eppie finishes the story with this line. "Oh, Father," said Eppie, "what a pretty home ours is. I think nobody could be happier than we are." And that's the book. I know I skipped over a bit, like the chapter about Silas visiting his hometown, and several chapters of the townsfolk conversing about everyday things like the existence of ghosts, but those are more fluffy world-building things that don't impact the main story too much. But those chapters are still an interesting read due to the narrator's commentary about the town and its people. Anyway, back to you, Kishti. Thanks, editor! Now, going back to where I left off, Matilda is now roughly 8-ish years old, and John started paying more attention to her, probably due to the combination of regretting abandoning her and his wife Nancy Lambert, played by Laura Linney, suffering from being unable to hold onto a pregnancy long enough to give birth. But as time moves on, Nancy notices her husband watching Matilda very closely, and she makes the assumption that his want for a child is being shown through his time with Matilda.
Michael McCann has her because of me.
Not quite understanding what John is saying, Nancy asks John if Matilda is his biological child, and John answers her the truth.
I thought I could be strong. Just having her in the house. Look, Nancy, the woman who died in the snow was her mother. And
I thought it was strange. How you seem so close to Matilda now, I understand, is not so strange at all.
After their argument, the couple then discuss a plan of action with the lawyer about legally claiming Matilda as their child. And with said advice, the couple gets started with their plan of claiming Matilda. First, John gives Matilda her very own horse, then makes her promise to keep it a secret from Michael, thus creating a special relationship between himself and Matilda, while also causing a rift between Matilda and Michael's relationship.
I just think that maybe you shouldn't go up to the Newlands so much.
Why?
Well, you live here, and it's, you can overstay your welcome.
But they invite me.
I know, but sometimes it's possible to abuse a situation without really realizing it.
I want to go. It's not hurting anyone.
Not so much and not so often.
I'm going.
Well, sometimes you can't have everything you want. Now just don't be greedy.
Look who's talking.
Next, the couple hired someone to create a story for the press, making John look like a victim of his own mistakes, and is trying to make things right by bringing his daughter home.
You couldn't have written it better yourself.
I did write it myself.
Then finally, they approach Michael about custody over Matilda by introducing the legal system.
You're Michael McCann.
And I represent her.
You are served.
Wow, a politician going straight to suing instead of talking it out with the affected party. What a surprise! Predictable people are predictable. Shocking news at 9. So the trial begins, and it goes pretty much as well as Michael's adoption interview. Bad.
Perhaps you can tell us some other things that Mr. McCann does that are different?
Yes, he has educated Matilda in his own way. When she was learning to read, he told her not to read the books from school, but instead read the books that he gave her, adult books.
He wouldn't let her read the school books.
Because she didn't want to read the school books?
So he let her read adult books.
Yes, right. No, not adult books.
Now, in between breaks from the trial, the flooded stone quarry next to Michael's house is being drained and the water pumped into a new lake that was constructed by John, much to the delight of everybody in town. Now, why is this important to mention, you might ask? Here's your hint.
You're killing me! You're killing me!
on this place or someone's gonna fall in!
Back to the trial, Matilda struggles with her emotions and thoughts about John being her biological father, and who is also the one trying to take her away from the home she grew up in. Yes, she enjoyed visiting the Newlands, yes, she enjoyed the horseback riding lessons, and being gifted a horse, but as she sat there listening to all the testimonies and Newland's lawyer doing what he could to make John look good and Michael look bad, Matilda decided to take action by letting the court know who she deems to be her real father.
I could never be separated from him. He's the one who's taking care of me. He's the one who's inspired me. And now that I'm entering my years of womanhood, I'm gonna need his guidance more than ever. I could never be anything without my loving daddy.
Unfortunately, that didn't sway the judge very much, since the true argument for the case is who can financially care for Matilda until she becomes an independent adult.
Do something right for once.
Well, I can't go against Newland. There's too much. Going way back, father to father, now son to son. How can I ask her to live in squalor? I can't give her to McCann, not without a powerful reason.
So the day comes for the final verdict, but before the judge can say what his decision is, there is a commotion happening outside, then April's son Lawrence rushes into the courtroom.
Well, let's go see what this is. Court is recessed for 1 hour.
All right.
The hell with that, let's go.
Everyone then makes their way to the Drainstone Quarry where something shocking is revealed. And seeing that Tanny's body has Michael's stolen gold, the main argument for the trial changed from who has the best finances to who does Matilda want to be with.
As a judge, I'm always interested in the exact moment when someone's argument falls apart.
And with that, the trial for custody of Matilda is settled, and the movie ends with a visit to Marcia's grave, where Matilda leaves flowers and a small note with her name written on it. The end! So, what are your thoughts on the book, editor? It's a very heartwarming and nice story to read. I personally am an avid reader who prefers action-adventure books like Percy Jackson, Ranger's Apprentice, etc., but reading something about the life of a lonely man finding love after a brutal betrayal by raising a young orphan girl into adulthood is beautiful. But what makes this story unique to me is that the narrator is another character to the story, commenting on how people viewed Silas and reasoning why certain conversations or beliefs are held. It honestly felt like an insightful history text about the way of life of English people in the 1800s, while disguised as a story about a few select characters from the town the narrator is dissecting. Similar to historic films like The Titanic, 17 Miracles, Apollo 13, and many others. Unfortunately, I didn't get to read the book during my high school days, possibly because my English education was all over the place, and I mainly read Shakespeare or collections of short stories, or short summaries of famous books that are hundreds of pages long that no classroom had time for. So I never got the fun experience of reading Silas Marner or any of George Eliot's books, and just have to hear it secondhand from other people, until I can afford my own copy of the book and find time to read it on my own. So if you have the time, I do highly recommend giving Silas Marner a read if you are in the mood for something toned down and heartwarming.
Just be yourself.
The story for the film was charming, silly, and calming to watch. The only harsh criticism I have is that the dialogue can get a bit forced or weird, mostly because they are lines from the book that the scriptwriters and actors tried to force into their more modern film, which sometimes works, but mostly doesn't, and you just have to deal with a slight cringe. As for the added comedy, I thought it was good. Other people criticized it for being forced or cringy, but weirdly enough, I never felt that. The comedy in the film was my kind of fun. Silly one-liners and slapsticks that don't dumb down the characters or make them flat out stupid. The jokes never overshadowed the main story, and with them, I had more fun with the story than I might have without them. The editing and cinematography of the film was well done, and the music was upbeat and charming. The casting was well picked, and the acting was, well, the norm for 90s family films, but it was enough for this particular story, and I liked it. So, if you're fine with a more chill movie with mild comedy, I think you'll enjoy this film. there were a lot of changes ranging from setting to order of main story beats, but the film still did very well sharing the story of the book. The only criticism I have about one particular change is the drastic name changes. The only person to keep their original name was Nancy, though I understand that Godfrey and Silas aren't that common of a name in the US, but April didn't keep Dolly and Marshall didn't keep Molly. I mean, changing one of those women's names kind of makes sense in the fact that both names sound very familiar, but why change both? Also, Dustin to Tanny? Out of all the name changes, this one was the weirdest. The change that I liked was aging down Matilda from young adult to child. By the time Godfrey told Nancy the truth, Eppie was already an adult who can make her own choices as to where she wanted to go, so there was no real tension or danger in the book of Eppie being taken away. While in the film, Matilda was only a few years into elementary school and can easily be forced into a new home if it means she can live more comfortably and have a successful future. The danger of Matilda being taken away was real and a high possibility due to John's influence over the town and his massive wealth. And because of the addition of the trial from Matilda's custody, does having Tanny's body reveal happen later make more sense? If Tanny was found earlier, there would be no trial, and we would have probably the same exact conversation as the book, and aging down Matilda would mean nothing. So now the question is this a good adaptation? I personally say yes. The film did its job in telling the original story, while also making enough changes to be its own thing. You don't need to read the book to understand what's going on, and watching the film doesn't take away the experience of reading the original story. Also, the film wasn't made to make money off the fan base, like so many other adaptations, and respected the source the story came from. Cool, I'm glad we can agree on that. Is there anything else you want to say about the adaptation? No, I think we covered everything I wanted to say. Good, I'm glad you're satisfied.